Thank you. So Steve Hayward has become sort of everybody's now go-to conservative on campus, in part because he, in fact, is conservative, in fact, because he happens to be a nice guy and one can talk to him. He is the senior resident scholar at the Institute for Government Studies here at Cal. He's also a visiting lecturer at Berkeley Law, which is what Bolt School is now called. He was previously the Ronald Reagan Distinguished Visiting Professor at Pepperdine, and he was a visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He was also a longtime fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's been a senior fellow at the Pacific Research Institute in San Francisco since 1991. He writes frequently for the New York Times, for the Washington Post, for the Wall Street Journal, National Review, Weekly Standard, and other publications. He is the author of 6 books, and I would like to welcome Steve to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, and thanks for the Goldman School for putting this together and extending the invitation. I don't know how many of you here are Goldman supporters or alums or friends and supporters. I don't get up there as often as I would like to, mostly because I'm lazy and I'd prefer to walk downhill instead of uphill. But when I do go there, I'm always astounded at the level of energy. It's as busy as Grand Central Station, and I'm always overwhelmed by it. That's not true of a lot of departments and programs, right? So those of you who are friends of Goldman should be very proud of the place, I think, even if it is a nest of liberals. I'll add it's a really great honor to share the stage with Arlie. Yeah, we have different viewpoints and could probably tangle a lot on particulars, and I actually hope we will at some point. Maybe not so much today, because there's a lot of overlap between what you think and I think. What's great about her book, and all of her books, I haven't read them all, I've just read a couple, but is that she practices a method I encourage to students. I teach mostly political philosophy and law, and I always say the first rule of interpretation, I think, whether you're talking about a thinker or another human being, is the first thing you should try to do is understand the person as they understand themselves before you try to understand them differently or better. They may be mistaken, there may be defects, there may be bad motives or mixed motives, but figure out what they think first. Too often these days we default to our own cliches about people who disagree with us and interest and all the rest of that, and that actually stops a sensible public discussion and deliberation. So Arlie's book is, and you know, spending, what, 5 years there, that's a model of how this ought to be done. I do think Louisiana is a strange place. I've thought about it a lot myself. I've only visited. I haven't done what Arlie's done. Oddly enough, it was one of the first of the Deep South states to break from the Democratic Party on the presidential level. It first voted for Dwight Eisenhower in 1956. Then it returned to the Democratic fold for a long time. Then Nixon wins, of course, in '72. Ronald Reagan wins it easily. Then Bill Clinton gets it back. And then the other thing I observe of it is it was the last of the Deep South states to turn wholly Republican. You know, it wasn't until just 3 years ago that the voters finally turned out the last Democratic senator, Mary Landrieu. And, you know, we'll see how this goes. I'm watching this Alabama election. You know, I'm a conservative Republican, but sometimes party loyalty is asking too much. And I'm not sure this Roy Moore guy is going to win. Latest poll this week, it's dead even, which is, in a certain way, that's a landslide for Democrats in Alabama these days, to be dead even. But, you know, they've picked one really crazy candidate. I'll just add one more personal note. I didn't attend Cal, neither did my wife. We like to think we're Cal boosters, though. My wife went to that little technical trade school down the peninsula in Palo Alto. Yeah, right, there you go. Oh, it gets better. She played the trombone in that anarchist troupe they call a marching band, where she found herself in the end zone on a particular famous game some of you may remember. And, you know, she was in a class with John Elway, who, my wife reflected later, I'm so glad there wasn't social media in those days because the band was really unpopular, right, on the campus. And she was in a class with John Elway, who said, "You maniacs," actually he used a different adjective beginning with M, but "you maniacs cost me the Heisman Trophy. So go Bears, and we're on your side." So I'm glad I can bring a few smiles because I want to approach this topic on a broader scale first and then focus down on the narrower question of the white working class. And my general theme is things are much worse than they seem. This is actually not a new thought. It's an expression of what I call Hayward's first law of insufficient paranoia, which holds that no matter how bad things look on the surface, when you look closer, you find out things are usually worse. So I want to talk a little bit, I'm a political scientist, I'm going to do it this way. I haven't done the on-the-ground one-on-one work that Arlie has, because political scientists don't do that. I'm struck by a couple of survey results of long-standing that ought to be on the mind and suggest the collapse of civic culture in this country that's been going on for quite a long time. One number that Gallup has been asking since the late 1950s, or one survey question is, do you have confidence in the federal government to do the right thing all the time or most of the time? Back in the late 50s, that number was 75% of people who said, yes, I have confidence in the federal government. For at least 15 years, that number has been around 15%. It struggles to get to 18%. If you look at the long-term trend line, which I think is what you try and do with consistent public opinion surveys, it blips up a couple of times. Once, ironically, is under Ronald Reagan, when that line reverses and goes up for a while. And then, of course, for some months or a couple of years after 9/11, when there's the rally around the country atmosphere, that, of course, proved evanescent, as I thought it would. By the way, I don't have time today. I have Hayward's second law of symmetric paranoia I can tell you about, too, but that's another one. So there's that. Now, it turns out that the surveys also ask, what do you think of state and local government? And those numbers are higher. People have higher confidence in state government, higher confidence in local government. And I think that's not surprising. I think that government's closer to where people live, and you can actually meet your representatives and executives more directly. On the other hand, we're seeing a collapse of the civic culture on the local level. The turnout for the last mayor's election in Los Angeles, I think, was 18% of eligible voters. Philadelphia and New York also had, I think it was 28% in New York for Mayor de Blasio. I may say more about that in a bit, but that's a really remarkable thing. The number that really ought to bother us, and this one predates Trump. It's been growing for a while. We know as a general matter that the surveys show declining trust in institutions. People are increasingly lack confidence in churches, big business, universities, the police. The military holds up pretty well. Courts, lawyers, go on down the list, right? It's all sort of gone down. So it's not just government or Washington that people are getting skeptical of. But there's one question that really jumps out at me. Do you have trust or confidence in your fellow citizens? That number used to be 70% yes. Now it's getting close to 60% no. In other words, it's not just institutions that we're doubting now, we're doubting each other. As I say, I think it needs to be known, that's a superficial number. I'm not happy with it. I don't want to overstate it, and that's the kind of phenomenon that's very hard to figure out with follow-up surveys, although I think it really needs to. But the general point, I think, stands. When we come to think of each other as wholly alien, we lose the capacity to be fellow citizens. So that's point one. I have 3 points here. The second point is demographics. So the white working class is the swing vote in American politics, at least in electoral terms. Let's look at the states where they made the difference this year. The white vote as a whole, forget stratifying from working class, middle class, professional class. It used to be about 80% of the electorate back when Ronald Reagan wins in 1980. Now it's down to about 68% and declining, as Frank Rich likes to celebrate. So it's a smaller share of the electorate. But it's been true, I think, for a long time that the white working class, people with high school educations, living often not in the big cities, they've been de-aligning from the Democratic Party for a long time, but didn't really become partisan Republicans necessarily. They do account for what made Ronald Reagan's victories into landslides. If you'd had sort of just a traditional Republican candidate, Reagan wins, I think, pretty easily, but especially in 1984, the people we called Reagan Democrats made that 84 election into a massive landslide. Some of you who know this may know that Macomb County, Michigan, that's sort of the great swing county. It went big for Reagan. Bill Clinton got a lot of those voters back, see, and kept them. And a lot of them stayed with Barack Obama, as Arlie mentioned, although a lot of them just didn't vote for several elections under President Bush, George W. Bush, and then also under Obama. A lot of them stayed home. So they are, in political science terms, the median voter. That's the term we political scientists use, the ones who determine the outcome of elections. Arlie mentioned something that I've seized upon. I usually talk about it this way. I was struck during the primaries, especially in the states that had open primaries, the number of people who'd showed up in polls and talked to bewildered journalists who said, I'm undecided between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. You would think that there could be no greater difference than a sort of Vermont socialist and a Manhattan billionaire. But there you were, and as the survey data shows, I don't know if you mentioned the numbers already, but the surveys say between 20 and 30% of Bernie voters voted for Trump in November. I don't think this is entirely brand new. If you go back and look at the 1972 Democratic primaries, a lot of voters would show up in polls saying, on the Democratic primaries, would say they were undecided between George Wallace and George McGovern. That also doesn't make a lot of sense if you think you're sort of politically engaged person. But the point is, these voters are sort of non-aligned and up for grabs. And as I say, Bill Clinton did a very good job of reaching them. Now, Arlie suggested, I didn't quite put it this way, but the way I took it or the way I'd modify it is, a lot of these voters are saying, no one's talking to us. You just want to say that. I think this is right. What did the Republicans offer the white working class? Well, think back 4 years ago. Republicans offered Mitt Romney. Nice, decent man, but what is he? He's a, Wall Street guy, essentially, who did what? Talked about the 47% who won't vote for me because they don't pay taxes. The kind of thing Ronald Reagan would never have said and wouldn't have thought. And what was his economic plan? Now, of course, Paul Ryan was his running mate. I know Paul, I like him, I agree with him on a lot of things, but they both suffer the defect of their economic plan was, well, the investor class is who we have to have tax cuts for. For the record, I disagree with that now. That might have made sense in 1980. I think it makes much less sense now, but that's a subject for another time. But that's what they're offering. So, if you're the unemployed coal miner, the unemployed auto worker in Wisconsin or Ohio, does that have any appeal to you? I don't think so. And so it was very easy for the Obama campaign to run a campaign against Richie Rich. I mean, Romney just sort of had it. John McCain was no better 4 years before. He adopted a tax cut plan because he thought, well, maybe some of you have heard this or maybe not. It's part of conservative lore. The late political journalist Robert Novak said that God put the Republican Party on the planet to cut taxes, and other than that, they're not worth a darn. And they're trying to prove that again right now. So that brings you to Trump. What did Trump do? It's really weird to say he was an effective communicator about a person who does not speak in complete sentences, right? But he treated them with respect. Here I think you want to contrast. I mean, we know, Hillary Clinton really did walk back as fast as she could the remark about so many of Trump's supporters are from a basket of deplorables, racist and all the rest of that. And that was, I think she knew immediately that was a mistake to say something like that. But remember, she also said, we're going to put a lot of coal miners and coal mining companies out of business. Now that got seized upon and exploited by Trump, who said, what? I love coal miners. Right? This is just say, what did Romney say? I don't know what he said, but I'm sure it was like, well, we're going to work on a research program on carbon capture and sequestration so we can keep our coal-fired power plants going. Which is going to move absolutely nobody. To be fair to Hillary, she did say, and I think this is an important point, she did say, the whole context, she said, look, I want to have a program that invests a lot of money in job retraining and to build new industries for the coal miners who are unemployed. That got left out. The problem, though, is that I don't think those promises from politicians are believable anymore. Liberal politicians in particular have been promising to revive Appalachia since Lyndon Johnson, and I think now people don't believe that much anymore. So that's why it didn't get covered, why it didn't work. Plus, people remember that Hillary said, you're a bunch of deplorables, right? I don't think that worked terribly well. I'll conclude with this. I was an anti-Trumper. I didn't think he could possibly win the nomination. I didn't think he could possibly win the election. I thought the Republicans have nominated the only person who could lose to Hillary Clinton. And conversely, I think it is possible Bernie Sanders might have beaten Trump. You don't know what would have happened in a sustained fall campaign, but I think there's a plausible case for that. I have come reluctantly to the view that maybe the pro-Trump people are right that he was the only Republican who could beat Hillary Clinton. I have a whole lot of reasons for thinking that. One of the curious things is the case against that. I'll just do it this way. I thought, yeah, Trump's going to turn out a lot of those disaffected white working class voters who've been staying at home or not voting or maybe voting for Obama twice. But he was going to lose so many voters. He was going to lose a lot of, especially suburban women, and he did. A lot of traditional Republican strongholds, he did very poorly. He barely won Orange County, where Romney won handily 4 years ago. And I didn't think he would make up those numbers. He actually got more Hispanic votes than Romney did. I thought it was going to plunge Hispanic votes, Republicans down into the single digits, like Republican share of the black vote, right? He got 33%, something like that. Romney got 30 or 29. I'm still baffled by that, although I've, heard things. Anyway, and then a lot of Republicans who had opposed Trump, like Marco Rubio in Florida, Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania, ran far ahead of him in those states. So you'd say, surely Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush or somebody, pick anybody, maybe even Ted Cruz, really unappealing guy, would have run better based on how so many Republican members of Congress ran more strongly than Trump did. I'm not sure that's correct. I actually think, and especially in the case of Ron Johnson, who won a very narrow re-election in Wisconsin, that Trump brought them in on their coattails. Those candidates kept a lot more of the traditional Republican vote than Trump did, but their margins of all those voters who came out for Trump and then voted kind of in a straight ticket fashion, because straight ticket voting has been coming back for the last 20 years, actually made it bigger. So at this point, people ask me to predict the future and say, look, I can't even predict the past. I was so bad about all this. I don't know what to predict, but there we are. That's sort of my reading on things, and I'll just stop there and we can go to questions.